Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Whispers. Tonight, we leave behind the safety of city streets and step into the world of America's truckers, the men and women who spend their lives on the open road, where isolation, darkness, and the unknown wait around every bend. For truckers, the highway isn't just a workplace. It's a battleground against fatigue, weather, and sometimes things far stranger, from phantom hitchhikers who vanish into thin air, to eerie lights that stalk rigs across desolate stretches of asphalt, and to voices on the CB radio that no living driver could have sent. These stories prove that the road can be every bit as haunted as any old house or forgotten graveyard. The 10 accounts you're about to hear are drawn from real truckers, men and women who face the unexplainable and live to tell about it. These are not just stories of strange encounters, but reminders that the greatest dangers often come not from the road itself, but from the shadows just beyond the headlights. If you're new to Horror Whispers, subscribe for nightly tales of the haunted, the bizarre, and the unexplained. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a chilling story whispered in the dark. So, dim the lights, buckle up, and keep your eyes on the mirrors. My name is Robert Hayes, and I've been driving trucks for 32 years. I've seen a lot of things on the road, accidents that still wake me up at night, storms that tried to flip my rig, and people doing things they shouldn't be doing in rest areas. But nothing prepared me for what I found on that October night in Alabama. I was running a load of furniture from Atlanta to Mobile, making good time despite the rain that had been following me since Birmingham. It was around 2:30 inches the morning when I pulled into the rest area just south of Montgomery. I needed to use the facilities and grab a quick cup of coffee from my thermos before the final push to the coast. The place was nearly empty, just one other truck parked way over on the far side, and a couple of cars that looked like they belonged to people catching some sleep. The overhead lights cast these harsh pools of yellow on the wet pavement, and beyond that, everything just disappeared into darkness. That's how it is at these places at night. You exist in this little bubble of light, and everything else might as well not exist. I parked my rig and climbed down, my boots splashing in a puddle I hadn't seen. The rain was coming down steady now. Not hard enough to be dangerous, but enough to make everything slick and miserable. I was walking toward the restroom building when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was crying. Not adult crying, but the kind of high-pitched, desperate wailing that only comes from something very small and very scared. At first, I thought maybe it was a cat or a small dog someone had abandoned. God knows I've seen enough of that over the years, people dumping pets at truck stops like they're garbage. But this sound was different. This sound made something deep in my chest tighten up. I followed the sound around the side of the building, past the vending machines that hummed and flickered in the night. There, near the dumpster, was what looked like a pile of old rags, or maybe a bag of trash that had fallen out of the container. Except the pile was moving, and the crying was coming from inside it. I approached slowly, not sure what I was going to find. When I got close enough to see clearly under the security light, my heart just about stopped. It was a baby. A newborn baby, wrapped in what looked like an old towel and a dirty t-shirt, lying there in the rain next to a dumpster like a piece of garbage. The baby was so small, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Still had that cord attached, if you know what I mean. Someone had given birth, wrapped this child up in whatever they could find, and then left it there to die. In the rain, in the cold, in the dark. I scooped that baby up so fast I almost slipped on the wet pavement. The little thing was ice cold, barely breathing, and crying with what little strength it had left. I ran back to my truck, grabbed my emergency blanket, the kind that looks like aluminum foil, and wrapped the baby up tight. Then I called 911. The dispatcher kept me on the line while I waited for the paramedics. She asked me to check if the baby was breathing regularly, if it felt warm, if the crying was getting stronger or weaker. I sat there in my cab with this tiny human being in my arms, watching its little chest rise and fall, praying to God that I hadn't found it too late. The paramedics arrived about 15 minutes later, though it felt like hours. They took one look at the baby and immediately started working. One of them told me that if I hadn't found the child when I did, it probably wouldn't have lasted another hour in those conditions. The cold, the rain, the shock of being born and then abandoned, any one of those things could have been fatal. They rushed the baby to the hospital, and I followed in my truck. I couldn't just drive away, you know. I needed to know that this child was going to be okay. I called my dispatcher and explained the situation. He told me to do whatever I needed to do, that the load could wait. At the hospital, they told me the baby was going to make it. Hypothermia, dehydration, but nothing that couldn't be treated. A healthy baby girl, they said. Someone's daughter, abandoned like trash but saved by a trucker who happened to need a bathroom break at exactly the right moment. The police investigated, of course. They found evidence that someone had given birth right there at the rest stop, probably in one of the cars I'd seen parked in the shadows. They never found the mother. Part of me hopes she was young and scared and maybe didn't know what else to do. Part of me hopes she found help and got her life together. But part of me will always be angry that someone could do that to a helpless baby. The story made the local news, and I got some attention I didn't really want. People calling me a hero and such. But I don't see it that way. Any decent human being would have done the same thing. You don't leave a baby to die. You just don't. That little girl would be about 18 years old now. I sometimes wonder what became of her. Whether she was adopted by a good family. Whether she knows how she came into this world. I hope she's happy. I hope she's loved. And I hope she never has to know about that night at the rest stop. About how close she came to never having a chance at life. People ask me if that experience changed how I look at rest stops. If it made me more cautious or more aware of what might be lurking in the shadows. The truth is, it did the opposite. It made me realize that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just pay attention. Listen. Look around. Because you never know when you might be the only person standing between life and death. That baby taught me something about the responsibility we all carry for each other. Every time I pull into a rest area now, I take a moment to really look around, to listen to the night sounds, to notice if anything seems out of place. Most of the time, it's just the usual collection of tired drivers and travelers. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone needs help, and you might be the only one there to provide it. I still drive that same route from Atlanta to Mobile, and I always stop at that same rest area. There's a small memorial garden there now. Nothing fancy. Just a little plaque and some flowers that someone maintains. It doesn't mention the baby specifically, but I know what it's for. It reminds me that this job isn't just about moving freight from point A to point B. Sometimes, it's about being in the right place at the right time to do something that really matters. My name is Marcus Thompson, and what happened to me at that Georgia rest stop still wakes me up in cold sweats 15 years later. People don't realize how vulnerable truckers are when we're parked for the night. We're sitting ducks out there in those rest areas. And there are people who know it. People who hunt drivers like predators stalking prey. I was running a dedicated route for a furniture company, hauling loads between their manufacturing plant in North Carolina and their distribution center in Jacksonville. It was good. Steady work with regular customers and familiar stops along the way. I'd been driving for about 8 years at that point and thought I knew how to stay safe on the road. I was wrong. The incident happened on a Tuesday night in March. I'd left Greensboro around noon with a full load of bedroom sets and dining room furniture, and I was making good time down I-95. My plan was to stop at the rest area just north of Valdosta for my mandatory 10-hour break, then push through to Jacksonville in the morning. I'd stopped at that particular rest area dozens of times before. It was well lit. Usually had decent security. and the facilities were kept reasonably clean. There were always other trucks there, which made me feel safer than stopping at some isolated truck stop in the middle of nowhere. Safety in numbers, or so I thought. I pulled in around 10:30 p.m., parked in my usual spot toward the back of the truck parking area, and settled in for the night. I had dinner, watched some television on my little portable set, and caught up on paperwork. Around midnight, I decided to make one last trip to the restroom before trying to get some sleep. The restroom building was about 100 yards from where I was parked, well within the circle of light from the overhead lamps. There were maybe 6 or 7 other trucks in the lot, and I could see the glow, the televisions in a couple of the cabs. Everything seemed normal, routine, safe. I walked across the parking lot, nodding to another driver who was doing his pre-trip inspection under the hood of his rig. The restroom building was one of those standard concrete block structures you see at highway rest areas. Utilitarian, institutional, designed to be vandal-resistant rather than comfortable. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that harsh, clinical glow that makes everyone look like they're dying. The men's room had 4 stalls and a row of sinks. 2 of the stalls were out of order, their doors propped open with maintenance signs. The 3rd stall was occupied. I could see feet under the door. I went into the 4th stall, the one farthest from the entrance. That's when I noticed something that should have set off alarm bells in my head. The feet under the door of the occupied stall weren't moving. They were just standing there, perfectly still. Like the person was just waiting, not using the facilities, not shifting weight, just standing, waiting. I finished my business and was reaching for the door latch when I heard the other stall door open, footsteps on the concrete floor. But they weren't heading toward the sinks or the exit. They were coming toward my stall. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I could see the shadow of someone standing there, blocking the light from underneath. My heart started racing, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the guy was waiting for me to come out so he could use this stall. Maybe the lock on his door was broken. Maybe he was drunk or confused. I opened the door and immediately knew I was in trouble. The man standing there was tall, probably 6'3" or 6'4", with prison tattoos covering his arms and neck. His eyes had that flat, predatory look that you learn to recognize after you've been around enough dangerous people. In his right hand, he held a knife, not a pocket knife or a utility blade, but a serious combat knife with a black handle and a blade that had to be 6 inches long. "Give me your wallet," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make any noise, and you might walk out of here." I was trapped. The stall was small, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, with nowhere to run and no room to maneuver. Behind me was a concrete wall. To my left and right were metal partitions, and in front of me was a man with a knife who clearly knew how to use it. "Look, man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't want any trouble. I'll give you whatever you want." I reached for my back pocket where I kept my wallet, but I was moving too slowly for his liking. He stepped forward and drove the knife into my side, just below my rib cage. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like someone had shoved a red-hot poker into my body. I gasped and stumbled backward, hitting the toilet and nearly falling. "Faster," he hissed, and I could smell his breath, cigarettes, and something else, something chemical and wrong. I pulled out my wallet with shaking hands and held it toward him. He snatched it away and flipped it open, counting the bills. There were maybe $40 in cash. Not much, but apparently not enough to satisfy him. "Credit cards," he said. "PIN numbers. I don't carry much cash." I stammered, pressing my hand against the wound in my side. I could feel blood seeping through my fingers. "The cards won't do you much good without." He cut me off by driving the knife into my shoulder, higher this time, the blade scraping against bone. I cried out despite myself, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. He immediately grabbed my throat with his free hand and squeezed. "Shut up," he whispered. One more sound and I'll cut your throat." The next few minutes felt like hours. He forced me to give him the PIN numbers for my debit cards, made me tell him about any cash I might have in my truck, asked about valuables I might be carrying in my load. Every time he thought I was lying or holding back information, he'd stick me with the knife in my arm, in my leg. Shallow cuts meant to hurt without disabling. I was getting weaker from blood loss and terror. My vision was starting to tunnel, and I could feel myself getting dizzy. I thought about my wife back home, about how she'd warned me to be more careful at truck stops. I thought about my kids and whether they'd understand why Daddy never came home. Then I heard something that might have saved my life. The restroom door opening and heavy footsteps coming across the floor. My attacker heard it too. His grip on my throat tightened, and he pressed the knife against my neck hard enough to draw blood. "One word, and you're dead," he breathed in my ear. The footsteps approached the stalls, and I heard a man's voice. "Everything all right in here?" Thought I heard someone yell. My attacker's eyes never left mine as he considered his options. I could see him calculating whether he could kill me quickly and quietly enough to deal with the newcomer. The knife pressed harder against my throat. "Yeah, everything's fine," my attacker called out, trying to make his voice sound casual. Just stubbed my toe on the door. There was a pause. The footsteps didn't move away. "You sure?" the voice asked. Sounded like someone was in pain. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Despite the knife at my throat, despite his threat to kill me, I screamed as loud as I could. "Help me! He's got a knife!" My attacker's eyes went wide with rage, and I saw him pull the knife back to drive it into my throat. But the newcomer was already moving. I heard him slam into the stall door, which burst inward despite the lock. The impact knocked my attacker off balance, and the knife sliced across my neck instead of plunging into it, a shallow cut that burned like fire but didn't hit anything vital. The man who'd come to help me was another trucker, who looked like he'd spent some time in the military. He grabbed my attacker's wrist and slammed it against the metal partition until he dropped the knife. Then he wrapped his arm around the guy's throat and dragged him out of the stall. I collapsed to my knees, blood running from multiple wounds, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and shock. Through the buzzing in my ears, I could hear the two men struggling, furniture banging around, and my rescuer shouting for someone to call 911. The police and paramedics arrived within minutes. My attacker, his name was Carl Brennan, and he had a long history of violent crimes, was arrested at the scene. The paramedics worked on me right there in the restroom, stopping the bleeding and starting an IV before loading me into the ambulance. I spent 3 days in the hospital getting stitched up and receiving blood transfusions. The doctors said I was lucky none of the knife wounds had hit major organs or arteries, though I came close to bleeding out from the cumulative blood loss. The cut on my neck missed my carotid artery by less than an inch. Brennan was eventually convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. During the trial, I learned that he'd been targeting truckers at rest stops across 3 states, robbing them in restrooms where they were most vulnerable. I was his 7th victim, but I was the first one who'd survived to testify against him. The experience changed everything about how I approach my job. I never go into a rest area bathroom alone at night anymore. I always let other drivers know where I'm going and when I expect to be back. I carry pepper spray and a flashlight, and I trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. But the biggest change is mental. I lost something that night that I've never gotten back: the ability to feel truly safe on the road. Every time I pull into a rest area after dark, I remember the feeling of that knife against my throat, the smell of that man's breath, the certainty that I was about to die far from home and family. The trucker who saved me was named Bill Morrison. He was dead heading back to Oklahoma after delivering a load in Savannah. We stayed in touch for a few years after the incident, but eventually lost contact. I think about him sometimes, about how he heard someone in distress and didn't just walk away. In a world where people increasingly mind their own business, he made the choice to get involved, to help a stranger, to risk his own safety for someone else. That choice saved my life. Carl Brennan would have killed me that night if Bill hadn't decided that a cry for help was worth investigating. I owe him everything, and I've tried to pay that debt forward over the years by being the kind of driver who looks out for his fellow professionals, who doesn't ignore signs of trouble, who's willing to get involved when someone needs help. The truth is, we're all vulnerable out there on the road. We're away from home, often alone, carrying valuable cargo, and dealing with people who know our routines and our weak points. Predators like Brennan count on our isolation, on the fact that we're often too proud or too stubborn to admit we need help. That night in Georgia taught me that survival sometimes depends on being willing to scream, to make noise, to shatter the silence that predators depend on. It taught me that there are still good people in the world, people like Bill Morrison who will risk their own safety to help a stranger. And it taught me that the most dangerous moments in a trucker's life often come not on the highway, but in those brief minutes when we step away from our rigs and become just another vulnerable human being in the darkness. My name is David Castillo, and I need you to understand something right from the start. What happened to me on Highway 101 north of Los Angeles wasn't an accident. It wasn't road rage. It wasn't some drunk driver who lost control. It was attempted murder, plain and simple, carried out by people who planned it, executed it, and then vanished into the night like ghosts. I'd been driving for 12 years when this happened, running primarily West Coast routes for a mid-sized logistics company based in Phoenix. Good company, good equipment, good relationship with dispatch. I knew the roads between Los Angeles and San Francisco like I knew my own driveway. Every curve and grade and merge lane burned into my memory from hundreds of trips. The load I was hauling that night was nothing special: electronics from a warehouse in Carson up to a distribution center in San Jose. Computers, tablets, smartphones, the kind of high-value cargo that companies move every day without incident. The trailer was sealed. The paperwork was in order, and I was making good time despite the usual Los Angeles traffic nightmare. I'd left the warehouse around 6 p.m., planning to drive through the night and deliver first thing in the morning. It was a route I'd run dozens of times, and I knew exactly where I'd stop for fuel, where the good truck parking was, and how to time the trip to avoid the worst of the San Francisco morning rush. Everything was normal until I reached the stretch of 101 between Thousand Oaks and Santa Barbara. It's a beautiful piece of highway during the day, winding through hills and valleys with glimpses of the ocean in the distance. But at night, especially on a weeknight when traffic is light, it can feel isolated and exposed. Long stretches with no exits, no services, no place to go if something goes wrong. I was about 2 hours into the trip, maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour in the right lane, when I first noticed the car. It was a dark sedan, looked like a late-model BMW or Mercedes that had been pacing me for about 10 miles. Not passing, not falling behind, just maintaining the same speed in the left lane, keeping even with my cab. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sometimes people set their cruise control and zone out, or they're talking on the phone and not paying attention to their position relative to other vehicles. But after another few miles, I started to get uncomfortable. The car had plenty of opportunities to pass me completely or drop back, but it just stayed there, matching my speed exactly. I tried slowing down to 60, thinking they'd go around me. The car slowed down too. I sped up to 70, and the car kept pace. That's when I started to get genuinely worried. I reached for my CB radio to see if any other drivers in the area had noticed anything unusual. That's when they made their move. The sedan suddenly swerved toward me, crossing the lane divider and slamming into the left side of my cab. The impact was tremendous, like being hit by a wrecking ball. My truck lurched to the right, toward the shoulder and the guardrail beyond. I fought the wheel, trying to maintain control. But the car hit me again before I could stabilize. I knew immediately that this wasn't an accident. The impacts were too deliberate, too well-timed. These people knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to force me off the road, and they didn't seem to care if they killed me in the process. I managed to keep the truck upright and on the roadway through the first 2 impacts. But I could feel the rig becoming unstable. With a full load and a high center of gravity, tractor-trailers don't handle lateral forces well. Each impact was pushing me closer to the point where physics would take over, and the truck would go over. The 3rd impact came just as we reached a sweeping curve to the right. The sedan hit me hard on the left rear of the trailer this time. A perfectly timed strike that sent the back end sliding toward the outside of the curve. I felt the trailer start to jackknife, the back end coming around as the connection between the tractor and trailer reached its breaking point. I had maybe 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether I lived or died. I could try to fight the jackknife and probably end up rolling the truck down the embankment. Or I could try to steer into it and hope I could bring the rig to a controlled stop. Neither option was good, but the first one was certain death. I turned the wheel hard to the right and took my foot off the accelerator, trying to get both the tractor and trailer pointed in the same direction again. For a moment, I thought I might save it. The truck straightened out, and I felt the wheels grab the pavement. But we were going too fast and had too much momentum. The rig went off the shoulder, crashed through the guardrail, and started rolling down the embankment. The next 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. The truck rolled over twice, maybe 3 times. I lost count after the second impact. Each roll was accompanied by the sound of metal tearing, glass shattering, and cargo shifting violently inside the trailer. I was thrown around inside the cab despite my seatbelt, my head hitting the door frame, the ceiling, the passenger seat. When the truck finally came to rest at the bottom of the embankment, I found myself hanging upside down in the cab, held in place by my seatbelt, blood running from my nose and mouth. The cab was partially crushed, the windshield was gone, and I could smell diesel fuel leaking from somewhere underneath the wreckage. I managed to get my seatbelt undone and crawled out through where the windshield used to be. My left arm was broken, I had several cracked ribs, and my head was pounding from what was probably a concussion. But I was alive. The trailer had separated from the tractor during the roll and was lying on its side about 50 feet away. Electronics scattered across the hillside like confetti. I looked back up at the highway, expecting to see the sedan that had forced me off the road. Maybe they'd stopped to see if I was dead. Maybe they'd called 911. Maybe they'd realized what they'd done and were trying to help. But the highway was empty. No cars, no flashing lights, no sign that anyone had witnessed what happened to me. It took me nearly an hour to climb back up the embankment to the roadway. By the time I reached the guardrail, my broken arm was on fire with pain, and I was dizzy from the head injury. I flagged down a passing motorist who called 911, and the paramedics arrived about 20 minutes later. The police investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately frustrating. They found clear evidence of paint transfer on what was left of my truck, dark blue paint that matched the color of the sedan I'd described. They found tire marks on the highway that showed the deliberate nature of the impacts. They even found a piece of the other car's bumper at the scene, but they never found the car itself, and they never found the people who were driving it. The license plate number I'd managed to get turned out to be fake. The paint analysis didn't narrow down the make and model enough to be useful. The piece of bumper could have come from any one of thousands of similar vehicles. The insurance investigation was equally inconclusive. My company's insurer paid for the truck and the lost cargo, but they classified the incident as a hit and run rather than attempted murder. The police kept the case open for 2 years, but eventually, it went cold. No arrests, no charges, no justice. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital and another 3 months in physical therapy. The broken arm healed, the ribs mended, and the concussion symptoms eventually faded. But I never fully recovered from the psychological impact of what happened that night. The knowledge that someone had deliberately tried to kill me, that they'd succeeded in destroying my truck and nearly ending my life, and that they'd gotten away with it. I went back to driving after my medical leave, but I was never the same driver I'd been before. Every car that paced me for more than a few miles made me nervous. Every time I drove that stretch of 101, I found myself looking for dark sedans, watching my mirrors obsessively, planning escape routes in case someone tried to force me off the road again. The company was understanding about my concerns and eventually transferred me to different routes, mostly shorter hauls that kept me closer to home. But the fear followed me everywhere. I'd wake up at night in a cold sweat, reliving those moments when the sedan was ramming into my truck, when I felt the trailer start to jackknife, when I realized I was going to roll down that embankment. I stayed with the company for another 8 years, but I never felt truly safe on the road again. Every trip was shadowed by the memory of that night, by the knowledge that there are people out there who view truck drivers as targets, who are willing to commit murder for reasons I still don't understand. I retired from driving 5 years ago, but I still think about that night on Highway 101. I wonder who was in that sedan, why they targeted me specifically, and whether they've done the same thing to other drivers. I wonder if there are cases out there, trucks that rolled over, drivers who died that were classified as accidents when they were really murders. The truth is, we'll never know how many truckers have been targeted by predators like the ones who forced me off the road. When a truck rolls over on a dark highway and the driver dies, it's usually investigated as a single vehicle accident, unless there's obvious evidence of another vehicle's involvement. Skid marks fade, paint transfers get overlooked, and witnesses are rare on isolated stretches of highway. I was lucky. I survived, and I was able to tell the investigators exactly what happened. But I can't help thinking about all the drivers who weren't as fortunate, who took their last breaths, trapped in the wreckage of their trucks while their killers drove away into the night. The case remains, unsolved. Somewhere out there are the people who tried to murder me, who destroyed my truck and my cargo, who changed my life forever and then disappeared without consequence. They might be dead now, or in prison for something else, or still out there hunting drivers on dark highways. I tell this story not to frighten people, but to remind them that the world can be a dangerous place in ways we don't always recognize. That truck you pass on the highway isn't just a vehicle, it's someone's workplace, someone's livelihood, someone's life. The person behind the wheel is someone's spouse, parent, child, trying to make an honest living in a profession that's more dangerous than most people realize. And sometimes, that danger comes not from mechanical failure or bad weather or driver error, but from the deliberate actions of people who have chosen to make highways their hunting grounds, who view truck drivers as prey, and who count on the isolation and darkness to cover their crimes. My name is Tom Henriksen, and I want to tell you about my friend Jake Sullivan, because Jake's not here to tell his own story anymore. Jake died alone in his truck on a winter night in North Dakota, and while the coroner ruled it death by exposure, those of us who knew him understood it was really death by panic, by a split-second decision that cost him everything. Jake and I had been driving team for about 3 years, running long-haul routes from the Pacific Northwest to the East Coast. We were a good match. He was steady and reliable. I was more aggressive with scheduling and route planning. He handled the paperwork. I dealt with dispatchers and customers. We made decent money and had gotten to the point where we could predict each other's reactions to almost any situation on the road. The run that killed Jake started out routine. We'd picked up a load of lumber in Oregon, bound for a construction company in Albany, New York. It was January, and I knew we'd be driving through some nasty weather once we hit the northern plains, but we'd done it dozens of times before. Both of us were from Minnesota originally, so winter driving wasn't foreign to us. We'd made it as far as Bismarck, North Dakota, when the weather started deteriorating. The forecast called for a major winter storm system moving down from Canada, with blizzard conditions expected across the northern tier of states. Wind chills were predicted to drop below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with snow accumulations of 18 to 24 inches and sustained winds of 40 to 50 miles per hour. We stopped at a truck stop on the outskirts of Bismarck to fuel up and reassess our options. The smart play would have been to get a motel room and wait out the storm. But we were already running behind schedule due to delays at the loading dock in Oregon. The customer in Albany was expecting the lumber for a job that was supposed to start Monday morning, and our dispatcher was pressuring us to keep moving. Jake wanted to wait. I remember him standing next to the truck, looking at the sky and shaking his head. "This feels wrong," he said. "That wind is already picking up, and look at those clouds. This is going to be a bad one." I should have listened to him. Jake had good instincts about weather, better than mine. But I was focused on the delivery schedule, on keeping the customer happy, on avoiding the penalty fees we'd face if we were late. I convinced him that we could make it through the worst of the storm if we left immediately and pushed hard for the next 6 hours. "We'll stay on I-94, I told him. "Major interstate, good maintenance, lots of traffic. If it gets too bad, we'll find a place to stop, but let's at least try to get ahead of the storm front." Jake reluctantly agreed, and we climbed back into the truck. The plan was for me to drive the first shift while Jake slept in the bunk. Then we'd switch around midnight when we reached the Minnesota border. It seemed manageable when we were sitting in the warm cab of the truck, drinking coffee and listening to the weather radio. The first 2 hours weren't too bad. The snow was falling steadily, but it was that dry, powdery snow that blows around without sticking too much to the pavement. Visibility was reduced, but not dangerously so. I kept the truck at a steady 55 miles per hour and maintained radio contact with other drivers who were monitoring the weather situation. But around 10 p.m., everything changed. The wind picked up dramatically, going from a manageable breeze to sustained gusts that were strong enough to push the truck around the highway. The snow went from falling straight down to coming at us horizontally, creating a white wall that reduced visibility to almost zero. I woke Jake up and told him we needed to make a decision. We were about 40 miles west of Jamestown, North Dakota, in one of the most desolate stretches of I-94. There were no truck stops, no rest areas, no towns of any significant size for the next 30 miles in either direction. "We should have stayed in Bismarck," Jake said, looking out at the whiteout conditions. This is exactly what I was afraid of. But stopping on the interstate wasn't really an option either. The shoulder was already drifted over with snow, and with zero visibility, parking a truck there would be like setting up a roadblock for other vehicles that couldn't see us until it was too late. We decided to keep moving, but at a much slower pace. I dropped our speed to 35 miles per hour and turned on every light we had: headlights, clearance lights, hazard flashers, work lights. Jake got on the CB radio and started broadcasting our position every few minutes, warning other drivers about the conditions and our location. That's when we came over a hill and saw the red glow of flares in the distance. There'd been an accident. Looked like a 4-car pileup that was blocking both lanes of the interstate. State patrol cars were on scene, and traffic was being diverted off the highway at the next exit. The exit led to a small farming community called Valley City. Maybe 200 people, a gas station, a grain elevator, and not much else. But there was a wide spot next to the grain elevator where several trucks had already pulled over to wait out the storm. It looked like the safest option available. We parked the truck and settled in to wait. Jake called our dispatcher to report our location and the delay. I made some coffee and checked our food supplies. We had enough provisions to last 24 hours comfortably, maybe 48 hours if we rationed carefully. The truck had a good APU, auxiliary power unit, that could keep us warm and provide electricity without running the main engine constantly. Around 2 a.m., our APU quit. Jake tried everything, checking fuses, resetting breakers, following the troubleshooting guide in the manual. But it was dead, and without it, we were dependent on the main engine for heat. Running the engine continuously would burn through our fuel quickly, and with the blizzard still raging, there was no guarantee we could get to a gas station before running out. We decided to take turns running the engine for heat. 1 hour on, 2 hours off, trying to balance staying warm with conserving fuel. Jake took the first watch while I tried to sleep in the bunk. The temperature inside the cab dropped steadily during the off periods, but it was manageable with our winter gear and sleeping bags. By dawn, the storm had intensified even further. The wind was howling around the truck with a sound like a freight train, and the snow was falling so heavily that we couldn't see the other trucks that we knew were parked nearby. The radio was full of emergency broadcasts. The entire state of North Dakota was essentially shut down, with travel impossible and power outages widespread. That's when Jake made the decision that killed him. We were running low on fuel. Maybe 3 hours of engine time left. The temperature outside had dropped to -3.5, with wind chills approaching -6.0. Jake was convinced that we were going to freeze to death if we stayed with the truck, and he remembered seeing what looked like a highway department maintenance building about a quarter-mile back down the road. "I can make it there," he told me. "It's got to be warmer than this truck, and maybe there's a phone I can use to call for help." I tried to talk him out of it. In whiteout conditions like that, a quarter mile might as well be 100 miles. It would be easy to get disoriented, to walk in circles, to lose sight of any landmarks and freeze to death within sight of shelter. "We should stay with the truck," I argued. "Someone will find us here. The other drivers know where we are. The highway patrol will be checking on stranded vehicles once the storm passes." But Jake was convinced that leaving was our only chance. He'd worked himself into a state of panic, convinced that we were going to die if we stayed put. He bundled up in every piece of winter gear. He had insulated coveralls, parka, wool hat, insulated boots, heavy gloves. He took a flashlight and promised to follow the fence line that ran parallel to the road. "If I'm not back in 2 hours," he said, "fire up the engine and try to stay warm. I'll send help as soon as I find some." I watched him disappear into the whiteout, his flashlight beam swallowed by the blowing snow within seconds. That was the last time I saw Jake alive. 2 hours passed, then 4, then 8. The storm finally started to break around noon, and I could see the other trucks that had been parked nearby. I called out to the other drivers, and we organized a search party to look for Jake. We found him about 200 yards from the truck, less than halfway to where he thought the maintenance building was located. He was lying in a snowdrift, curled up in a fetal position, his flashlight still clutched in his frozen hand. The medical examiner later determined that he died of hypothermia, probably within an hour of leaving the truck. The maintenance building he'd been trying to reach was actually 3/4 of a mile away, not a quarter mile as he'd estimated, and it was locked up tight, with no heat and no phone. Even if he'd made it there, he probably would have frozen to death anyway. The rescue crews reached us about an hour after we found Jake's body. Highway plows had finally been able to clear the interstate, and emergency vehicles were checking on stranded motorists. They had generators, heaters, hot food, and medical supplies. If Jake had just waited another few hours, he would have been fine. The other trucks that were parked near us had all made it through the storm without major problems. A couple of them had APU failures like we did, but they'd managed their fuel carefully and stayed warm enough to survive. None of the other drivers had attempted to leave their vehicles. I rode in the ambulance with Jake's body to the hospital in Jamestown. The paramedic told me that hypothermia creates a kind of confused mental state, especially in the final stages. People make irrational decisions, like taking off their clothes when they're freezing, or wandering away from shelter into certain death. He probably didn't suffer much at the end, the paramedic said. Hypothermia is actually a relatively peaceful way to die. You just get sleepy and confused, and then you don't wake up. That didn't make me feel any better. Jake died because he panicked, because he let fear override his common sense, because he couldn't wait a few more hours for help to arrive. He died 200 yards from safety, with rescue crews already on their way to his location. The company was good about it. They paid for Jake's funeral, took care of his family, and didn't blame me for the decisions we'd made. But I blamed myself for a long time. I was the one who'd pushed to leave Bismarck despite the weather warnings. I was the experienced driver who should have made better decisions. I never drove team again after Jake's death. I couldn't handle the responsibility of making decisions that might affect another person's survival. I went back to driving solo, shorter runs, routes that kept me closer to civilization and help. But I learned something important from Jake's death, something that has kept me alive in the years since. The most dangerous moment in an emergency is often when panic takes over, when fear makes you abandon a marginally safe situation for one that's almost certainly fatal. Jake's truck had fuel, shelter, communications equipment, and other drivers nearby who knew his location. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't warm, but it was survivable. The blizzard outside offered almost certain death to anyone foolish enough to venture into it on foot. Yet panic convinced him to trade the truck's limited safety for the storm's guaranteed lethality. Fear made him believe that any action was better than waiting for help. It's a mistake that gets people killed in emergencies of all kinds, from sinking ships to burning buildings to winter storms. The highway department later installed emergency call boxes along that stretch of I-94, spaced every half-mile and equipped with direct lines to dispatch centers. They also built a proper rest area with heated buildings and backup power systems. Jake's death contributed to safety improvements that have probably saved other lives over the years. But that doesn't bring Jake back, and it doesn't erase the memory of watching him walk into that whiteout, or finding his frozen body in the snow, or knowing that he died because panic overcame judgment at the worst possible moment. I still drive past that spot occasionally when my routes take me through North Dakota. There's nothing there to mark where Jake died, no memorial, no cross, no sign. Just a stretch of highway that looks like every other stretch of I-94 across the world in northern plains. But I always slow down when I pass it, and I always remember my friend who froze to death 200 yards from safety, killed not by the storm but by the fear of the storm. My name is Roberto Vasquez, and I was the ICE agent who opened that trailer in the parking lot outside Laredo, Texas, on a sweltering July afternoon in 2003. What I found inside changed my perspective on human trafficking forever and haunts me to this day, 17 years later. I'd been working immigration enforcement for 8 years at that point, primarily focused on the smuggling operations that moved people and drugs across the Texas-Mexico border. It was dangerous, often frustrating work, but I believed in what we were doing. I'd seen too many families destroyed by cartels, too many young people lured into smuggling operations that got them killed or imprisoned. The case started with a routine traffic stop on I-35, about 30 miles north of Laredo. A Texas state trooper had pulled over a tractor trailer for speeding and noticed that the driver seemed nervous and evasive when asked about his cargo and destination. The trailer was supposed to be carrying furniture from a factory in Mexico to a warehouse in San Antonio. But something about the paperwork didn't look right. The trooper called for backup and requested an ICE agent to assist with the inspection. That's how I ended up standing on the side of Interstate 35 at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, watching as the driver, a man named Carlos Mendez, paced nervously beside his truck while we prepared to open the trailer. Mendez kept insisting that he was just hauling furniture, that he didn't know anything about the cargo beyond what was on the manifest. But his hands were shaking, and he was sweating profusely despite the air conditioning in the patrol car where we'd asked him to wait. His story about the pickup and delivery didn't match the paperwork, and he couldn't provide contact information for either the shipper or the consignee. When we broke the seal on the trailer and opened the rear doors, The first thing that hit us was the smell. It was the unmistakable odor of human waste, vomit, and death. A smell that gets into your nostrils and stays there for days. The second thing we noticed was the sound. Moaning, crying, and weak voices calling for help in Spanish. The trailer was packed with people, not furniture, not cargo, but human beings crammed into a space that was never designed for passengers. Men, women, children, all packed together in conditions that were worse than anything I'd seen in my years of law enforcement. There were 73 people in that trailer. 19 of them were already dead. The living were in various stages of heat exhaustion and dehydration. Some were unconscious, others were barely responsive, and many were crying or praying in languages I didn't understand. The temperature inside the trailer was estimated to be over 150 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no ventilation system running, no water, no sanitation facilities of any kind. The dead were scattered throughout the trailer, some lying on the floor where they had collapsed, others still standing upright, held in place by the press of bodies around them. Some had been dead for hours. Others had died more recently. The survivors had been forced to stand among the corpses, unable to move them, unable to escape the horror of watching their fellow passengers die one by one. I immediately called for every ambulance and emergency medical team in the San Antonio area. It took nearly 3 hours to get all the survivors out of the trailer and transported to hospitals throughout the city. Many of them required intensive care for severe dehydration, heat stroke, and other life-threatening conditions. Several more died in the hospital despite the medical team's efforts. The scene inside that trailer will haunt me for the rest of my life. People packed so tightly together that they couldn't sit down or move more than a few inches in any direction. Children separated from their parents in the chaos, crying for family members they couldn't reach or see. Elderly people who had collapsed from the heat and couldn't be helped because of the press of bodies around them. The survivors who were still conscious enough to speak told us a story that was both heartbreaking and enraging. They had paid between $5,000 and $15,000 each to be smuggled into the United States, money that represented years of savings or massive debts they had incurred to family members and loan sharks. They had been promised safe passage and comfortable transportation to cities throughout the United States where jobs were supposedly waiting. Instead, they had been loaded into the trailer like cattle in the early morning hours at a warehouse outside Laredo. The smugglers had told them the journey would take 8 to 10 hours and that the trailer's refrigeration system would keep them cool during the trip. They had been given small bottles of water and told to remain quiet no matter what happened. But everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. The trailer's refrigeration system had failed shortly after they left Laredo, turning the insulated compartment into an oven that trapped and concentrated the July heat. The driver had been delayed at a way station for additional inspections, adding hours to what should have been a direct trip to San Antonio. When the truck finally reached San Antonio, Bradley had become confused about the delivery location and had driven around the city for hours looking for the right address. What should have been an 8-hour journey had stretched to nearly 24 hours. The small bottles of water ran out after the first few hours. The temperature inside the trailer climbed steadily throughout the day, reaching levels that made survival impossible for the most vulnerable passengers. The survivors described the horror of watching people around them collapse from heat exhaustion and dehydration, children crying for their mothers, elderly passengers who couldn't stand in the oppressive heat, pregnant women going into premature labor under conditions that were beyond inhumane. They had pounded on the walls of the trailer, screaming for the driver to stop and let them out. But Bradley later admitted that he had been instructed by the smuggling organization to ignore any sounds from the cargo area and to complete the delivery no matter what happened. He had been paid $1,200 to drive the truck from Laredo to San Antonio, and he was afraid of what the smugglers would do to him if he deviated from his instructions. When people started dying, the others begged him through the walls to open the trailer, to get medical help. to do anything to stop the nightmare that was unfolding. But Bradley kept driving, listening to people die in the back of his truck while he searched for an address he couldn't find. The investigation that followed revealed a sophisticated human trafficking operation that had been moving people across the border for years. The organization was led by a man named Homero Zamorano Jr., who coordinated the smuggling runs and recruited drivers like Bradley to transport the human cargo. Zamorano and his associates had transported hundreds, possibly thousands of people under similar conditions. We learned that this wasn't an isolated incident or a case of unusual circumstances creating a tragedy. There had been other trailers, other drivers, other groups of desperate people subjected to the same inhumane treatment. Most of those shipments had arrived without fatalities, which is probably why the organization had become completely indifferent to the safety and welfare of their human cargo. The people in that trailer weren't just statistics or illegal immigrants trying to break American law. They were families looking for work, parents trying to provide for their children, young people seeking education and opportunity. They came from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, countries where poverty, violence, and lack of opportunity had made staying home seem more dangerous than risking everything on a journey to America. One of the survivors was Maria Santos, a 32-year-old woman from Honduras who had brought her two children ages 8 and 12 on the journey. She had borrowed $20,000 from relatives and moneylenders to pay for the smuggling fees, planning to work in construction or domestic service in Houston to repay the debt and send money back to her extended family. Maria's 8-year-old daughter died in that trailer, collapsing from heat exhaustion in her mother's arms, while Maria begged other passengers to help her get to the walls where she could pound for the driver's attention. Maria herself barely survived and spent 2 weeks in intensive care. Her 2-year-old son survived physically but was so traumatized by watching his sister die that he didn't speak for months afterward. Another victim was Carlos Mendez, a 4-5-year-old construction worker from Guatemala who was traveling with his teenage nephew. Carlos had planned to work in Dallas, where he had cousins who had promised to help him find employment in the roofing industry. He had sold everything he owned and borrowed additional money to pay for the smuggling fee. Carlos died about 6 hours into the journey, collapsing from heat stroke while trying to help other passengers who were struggling in the oppressive conditions. His nephew survived but suffered permanent kidney damage from the severe dehydration. The boy had no other family in the United States and eventually was deported back to Guatemala, where he had no one to care for him. The youngest victim was a 2-year-old boy named Miguel, whose parents had brought him on the journey from Mexico. Miguel died in his father's arms, his small body unable to cope with the extreme heat and dehydration. His parents both survived physically, but I saw them at the hospital afterward, and I'll never forget the look in their eyes, the complete devastation of people who had lost everything that mattered to them in pursuit of a dream that had turned into their worst nightmare. James Bradley, Jr., who cooperated with our investigation, providing details about the smuggling organization and helping us identify other drivers and logistics coordinators. But his cooperation couldn't undo the horror of what had happened in that trailer. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Homero Zamorano Jr. and several other members of the organization received similar sentences. The prosecuting attorney described it as one of the worst human trafficking cases in U.S. history, not just because of the number of deaths, but because of the complete indifference to human suffering that the organization had demonstrated. But no amount of justice could restore the lives that were lost or undo the trauma experienced by the survivors. 10 people had died horrible deaths, suffocating in their own vomit and waste, watching their children and spouses die around them, abandoned by people who saw them as nothing more than cargo to be transported for profit. The survivors faced their own challenges. Many were traumatized by what they had experienced, unable to forget the sounds and smells of people dying around them. Some were allowed to remain in the United States as witnesses in the criminal cases, but others were eventually deported back to countries where they faced the same poverty and violence that had driven them to risk everything in the first place. The case exposed the brutal reality of human trafficking in the 21st century. These weren't isolated criminals preying on individual victims. This was organized crime, treating desperate human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and transported with no regard for their safety or welfare. The trailer where those 10 people died was eventually destroyed. But the Walmart parking lot where we found it looks exactly the same today. Shoppers park there every day, probably unaware that it was the scene of one of the worst human trafficking tragedies in American history. I transferred to a different division within Border Patrol about 6 months after the San Antonio case. I told my supervisors that I needed a change, but the truth was that I couldn't handle working human trafficking cases anymore. Every time I encountered people who had been smuggled across the border, I thought about that trailer, about the sounds of people dying, about children calling for parents they would never see again. The case changed my perspective on immigration enforcement forever. I still believed in border security and immigration law, but I developed a deeper understanding of the desperation that drives people to risk their lives for a chance at a better future in America. These weren't criminals or terrorists or threats to national security. They were families fleeing poverty and violence, looking for the same opportunities that have drawn people to America for centuries. The memorial service for the 10 victims was held at a Catholic church in San Antonio. I attended, along with many of the other law enforcement officers who had worked the case. Most of the victims' families couldn't afford to travel from Central America and Mexico for the service, so the pews were filled with strangers, community members, activists, and government officials who wanted to honor their memory. The priest spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan, about our responsibility to care for strangers and travelers who are in distress. He reminded us that these 10 people had died as strangers in a foreign land, but that they were children of God who deserved dignity and respect, even in death. I've carried that message with me in the years since, through other cases and other encounters with people who have been trafficked or smuggled across the border. Every person I meet who has made that desperate journey reminds me that immigration isn't just about policy and politics. It's about real people making impossible choices in circumstances that most Americans can't imagine. The 10 people who died in that trailer outside San Antonio were seeking the same things that have drawn people to America for generations: safety, opportunity, and the chance to build better lives for their families. They died because that dream was twisted into a nightmare by criminals who cared more about profit than human life. Their story is a reminder that human trafficking isn't an abstract crime that happens to other people in distant places. It's happening right here, right now, on American highways and in American cities. It's a reminder that all of us, regardless of our views on immigration, have a responsibility to ensure that people aren't dying horrible deaths in pursuit of the American dream. The case also revealed the inadequacy of legal immigration pathways for people fleeing poverty and violence. The desperation that drove those 108 people to climb into that trailer wasn't created by criminal organizations. It was created by circumstances in their home countries that made staying seem more dangerous than risking everything on a journey to America. James Bradley Jr. is serving a life sentence in federal prison, and he'll probably die there. Homero Zamorano Jr. and his associates are serving similar sentences, but somewhere out there, other trafficking organizations are still loading desperate people into trucks and trailers, still taking money from families who have nothing left to lose, still treating human lives as expendable commodities. Until we address the underlying causes of illegal immigration, the poverty, violence, and lack of opportunity that drive people to risk their lives for a chance at a better future, tragedies like what happened in San Antonio will continue to occur. The 10 people who died in that trailer were victims not just of criminal organizations, but of systems and policies that made legal immigration so difficult that desperate people saw no alternative to placing their lives in the hands of human traffickers. Their deaths serve as a reminder that immigration policy isn't just about border security or economic impact. It's about human lives, human dignity, and our responsibility to ensure that people aren't dying horrible deaths in pursuit of the dreams that America has always represented to the world. The refrigerated trailer where 10 people died and 98 others nearly died has been destroyed, but the memory of what happened there continues to influence how we approach human trafficking cases. It serves as a constant reminder that behind every trafficking statistic are real people with names, families, and dreams, people who deserve better than to be treated as cargo by criminals who see human desperation as a business opportunity.